Welcome to this week's episode of Catholic Re.Con Testimonies from Reverts and Converts. I'm your host, Eddie Trask. Don't forget to subscribe. I'm going to get right into this week's episode. This gentleman, Chris Vitale, welcome, buddy, first of all, to the program. I appreciate you being here. He reached out to me. He has a YouTube channel called The Reconverted Catholic, and he launched it around the same time that I launched this channel. We're just getting started. So he reached out. We had a nice conversation about dialogue with Protestants. And once I heard that he had a testimony that involved a period of atheism, I knew I wanted him to be on the show. So Chris, again, welcome. I appreciate this, and I look forward to hearing your lengthy testimony.
Thank you. Well, yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to catch up here again and have this dialogue. So on my channel, The Reconverted Catholic, when I started the channel, I released a 3-part series about my own reversion story to Catholicism, because I've actually been Catholic in the, 48 years I've been alive. I've been Catholic more than I've not been Catholic. Okay. Collectively, but I've had some fun sort of detours along the way, so to speak. But I released a 3-part conversion story because there was a lot to unpack, and even trying to keep that concise, there's quite a bit to my story. And it can sound like, wow, this guy was really just, it's almost like he lived 4 different lives and went many different directions. But, I like to call it in a more optimistic way that I was just, a seeker for a long time. I really wanted to find the truth,
Yeah.
So you actually, from our last dialogue, kind of inspired me to, I released another video recently, and I'm going to kind of draw on that a little bit,
Sure.
where I do a deeper dive into my atheist years. And so I may even refer to that as well, too. So I appreciate that, because I thought after our conversation, said probably now is a good time. And this also coincides with here locally, I've been talking with all the main parish I attend and diocese and other priests at other parishes about giving talks about, my time as a new atheist or militant atheist, very much militant atheist. And then how I escaped, being what we call like from the nuns, NONES.
Yes. Yeah.
So anyhow, so to give, I'll give an overview, and then we can fill in any gaps from there. I was born and raised Catholic. I know the term is cradle Catholic. And stayed that way up until right about, 18 years old. And when I had that decision as an adult to, if I wanted to continue being Catholic or what, I did complete, sacraments of penance and First Eucharist and confirmation, so forth, of course, baptized. I actually have an interesting story about my baptism. We get to that. I was actually baptized twice when I was a baby. So I may get into that a little bit later.
Sure.
But I was part of a family that kind of floated between being nominally a Catholic to at times devout, very devout. And as a kid, I just, and part of my own personality, I had, my parents were pretty strong role models in my life, and I just sort of followed suit with what they taught me. And I thought they always did a good job of substantiating why we should believe, in being Catholic, and not just because, so
yeah.
Sort of fortunate with that, but some of it was still based on, well, this is what you're supposed to believe, Chris. So, that's what you need to know. You don't need to know anything else. Just be Catholic. So I followed that for a long time, and I was even pretty devout myself. Like even, I can remember going back to 5th grade, like going through phases throughout my childhood of saying the rosary often.
Yeah.
And participating in, different ministries in the church, and I thought about, vocation to the priesthood. I did in high school, and even later on in my life, there was always something kind of really burning in my mind at what I wanted to do with that. So very much rooted into this faith. But then I had a job, my first job in high school, at a grocery store. I was a good old carryout, like bag groceries and push carts and all that fun stuff.
Yeah.
And for 3 years, imagine I did that. I had a friend of mine, a female friend of mine, who she was a little bit older than me and married. Her husband worked there as well. And she seemed to take a liking to me and having conversations. So I, bag groceries at her cash register quite a bit. And that developed into just a lot of conversations, bigger and bigger and bigger conversations, including the subject of religion and spirituality. And she was the first person to challenge me, like in a way I'd never been challenged. Some of these questions, they range from really basic questions like, well, how do you know that your religion is true, right? How do you know Catholicism is true? How do you know there's a God? You know, and really, really pushing on that. And she had taken some classes in philosophy, and so she started referring to Nietzsche and, you know, all the kind of the first, you know, sort of draft like atheists, you know, out there, prominent atheists that, you know, and see, so God is dead. And so we had some of the conversations, and it did start to shake my faith a little bit, because I thought, okay, here I was all this time, very fine with believing in God and Jesus Christ as my savior and just being a practicing Catholic, you know. And it's funny when I look back on it even now, I think it was a great marriage of just my life. I've always been a pretty analytical. This may even come out in this conversation. I'm pretty logical, analytical. Like I'm in my head a lot, you know, very much.
Yeah, me too, bro.
Aren't we all? Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I have to have some of that, right, to be kind of in the space and want to teach and engage with
sure.
Yeah, so, and have these kind of, you know, more complex conversations. And so, you know, she was, her name was Cindy, and she challenged me quite a bit. And I thought I thought it was just fine actually with that. Like, why would I be skeptical or ask any questions? But she had a lot of questions for which I didn't have answers, and that really bothered me. So then I, around 18 years old, and a year after I had completed my confirmation, sacrament of confirmation, I was a little bit on the fence about, okay, I think I'm becoming skeptical here. And I remember I had a friend of mine right after high school. He was very much, you know, atheist. In fact, he was brought up that way. You know, and he asked me this question one time, you know, in a conversation, you know, did man create God or did God create man? You know, that, you know, and that even then was like, wow. Yeah. How am I going to get out of that question, you know, right? And I was 18 too, so, you know, there's a lot to unpack with that. But I then spent the next several years, or some years seeking, so about age 25, and just asking a lot, investigating, reading about different religions. That's a whole video and a conversation in itself. So I'll fast forward to you could say my first girlfriend. I had serious relationship. She came from a very evangelical Protestant, born again, leaning Southern Baptist, you know, faith, and they were very much anti-Catholic. And they had the standard criticisms: why do you worship Mary? Why do you worship, you know? And there again, it was just piling on of like, oh, why Catholic, you know what I mean? This is awful, you know. Why don't I just pray straight to Jesus Christ? You know, why do I need to ask, you know, why do I pray to saints? Why do I pray to Mary? I was even kind of confused, you know. That managed to, and talking with a pastor at a church they attended, that led me to becoming, I actually did make the walk down the aisle at the end of a service after, you know, really sermon, and I was kind of there almost like handshaking, and yes, I want to be saved.
Yeah.
I gave my life to Christ. And so then I was heavily involved Protestant Christian for about 5 years. And you and I shared some experiences about that in our last video. And
now that church was Southern Baptist, the one where you approached the altar?
They called it non-denominational, but it was really Baptist leaning. And even pastor in his sermons, he would make references to, you know, well, we Baptists, you know, we love to eat, you know, kind of thing, and talking about like maybe like fellowships afterwards or whatnot. So the word came up a lot, but it didn't say specifically Baptist church. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say we could get into that sometime too. Why certain churches, so that they'll attract more people, may drop certain mainline denomination titles from their signage. In order to just make it more of a cast off all these weird things you've heard about the mainline denominations, come to this kind of free, you know what I mean? It's more of a free approach. They'll talk about that, where you're liberated. But anyway, go ahead. But
oh, it's a great point. Like, you know, everybody's welcome. Where, you know, this isn't about religion. This is about a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. It's all. You know, and I remember actually my first experience attending that church, there were a couple of folks outside, you know, just sort of kind of feeling out the crowd. And then they came to me, and I must have had this look on my face, like ask me a question about my faith, because sure enough, they came and they went right for the heavy hitter. So let me ask you, sir, he said, if you died and went to heaven, if you stood before Christ now, what would you say? Are you saved? You know what I mean? Too. And I'm sitting there like, again, I'd never been asked this in my whole life. Catholics ask each other, are you saved? You know what I mean? So,
you're like, I saw a sign that said free donuts. I'm only
right. It was like, what's this all about?
Yeah.
So I was like, okay, but I got into the groove, and I started to pick up on the terminology, and even how I evangelized, started using some of those same questions. So I was very involved, for quite some time. And I did like this idea. I appreciated, the sola scriptura idea that we know of. Okay, just go to everything for, go to the Bible for everything, basically. Sure. That's the final, that's the authority, and that's what you need to know. But then I started running into some problems, some questions in like Sunday school classes, and, and just fellowshipping with other, fellow Protestants at that church. Also around the same time, make a very long story short with this, I actually, I developed some health issues, related issues, to the point that it was a lot of question about if I was going to survive those health issues or not, too. Like I became severely ill. Almost emaciated how I looked from losing a lot of weight, and just feeling like, the way I describe it is almost like having the flu for like a few years, and all that goes with that, and, a lot of pain. And,
did you get to the root of it?
Yeah. So I have something inside systemic that creates like an autoimmune, issue and so forth. And I get some pretty frequent migraines. It's not fun stuff to talk about, but I've got it very well managed now.
Good.
But I went through a pretty scary time, including during that time where I was just, nothing was working. I was always feeling ill. And my then girlfriend at that time, her mother, we spent a lot of time together. We would have Bible studies. They called it family time on Sunday evenings. So we'd sit around and talk about the Bible. And her mother was very much, devout again, and wanting to, have like her kids saved, and me being part of them saved too. So, but I noticed their approach, and this isn't exclusive to Protestants. I've met Catholics like this too, Catholic Christians. But this, just give it all to God.
Yeah.
And whatever happens. And I noticed something that in their own lives, that, it seemed like things were always falling apart, but it was always about, well, God's going to give us an answer eventually. And, and nothing ever really happened. There's a kind of sidebar joke that's been around for years, maybe you've heard of it. Like there's a guy who lives in a house, and he hears word about a flood, and he sent like several signs, you know what I mean? A police car, a boat, and a helicopter, right? And the idea of it is he's like, he dies and he goes to heaven, he stands before, well, they say St. Peter then, and he's like, well, what happened here? You know what I mean? And then, he says, well, we sent you a police car, a helicopter, right? And what else did you want to do? So where I'm going with all that is that, I started to notice that, hey, seems like, okay, yes, we very much should have God in our lives and know that we can rely on God, right, for direction and guidance. But, it almost seemed like just a big cop-out. And that included regarding my health issues. So as I really spiraled downward, okay, and the people, my family, and, my girlfriend and her mother were really concerned about me. It turned more to just praying. Okay, that's nice. But then also that, and what really stuck out is I had a really a bad night, really moment where I just, I kind of broke down. I was curled up on a couch, and I was like, why does this keep happening to me? And real stuff, real talk, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And kind of crying, and just like calling out almost like to God, what's going on? Am I going to die? What? And I remember, it's not to throw shade at this person now, years later, but, my then girlfriend's mother saying, well, if it's time for God to call you home, then, it's your time. Now, I was in my 20s, first of all. Two, yes, that could have been possible, but that was just, to me, an awful, awful thing to say, to try to kind of deal with the situation. You know what I mean? Like, now just sort of get ready to die, Chris, because it could happen, And that wasn't acceptable to me. So I ended up making two big decisions. One, I just cut away from being, involved as a Christian altogether. and then became very skeptical. I ended up having conversations with friends who were more secular oriented, or maybe even atheist or agnostic, and they, sort of helped me put a lot of ideas in my head about how, wow, I've just was completely deceived over the last 5 years. Just a lot of people just feeding me a lot of sort of garbage about my life and God, and just give it all to God. And what made it even worse, probably for the folks involved, and what I ended up turning my life around quite a bit without being, involved or religious per se. You know what I'm saying? Right? I did, but that was just a matter of focus and having the right treatment. And maybe God had a, you know what I'm saying? I was at the time, maybe he had a hand or whatnot in guiding me in the right direction. But I wasn't thinking that. I was just too mad. I was mad at God. I was mad at everything. I'd already built up a large number of problems about the Bible, and then answers to my questions I would get. And part of why now I'm going to lead to how I became atheist, because I get a lot of morally questionable answers, like passages I would find in the Bible that to me were just, horrible.
Yeah.
Why would God be like that? I mean, many people ask that question, especially, when people focus on the Old Testament and what that all means and entails. And, and I would get answers just overly simplified, like, well, God's ways are higher than ours, and even if there's some ring of, you understand, of truth or an unpacking that, it just always seemed to be sort of like morally thuggish, like, God can just be a tyrant if he wants because he's God, you know what I mean? Versus how we understand it as Catholic Christians. It's a whole other dynamic, you know what I mean? And it makes sense at the end of the day, what we know, So that bothered me quite a bit. And then something I still don't understand to this day, it's like, I had this almost epiphany of questions and problems with being Christian, Christianity. And suddenly I became very scatterbrained, maybe more so than I am now, but seriously, I was just so all over the map about what to believe, what not to believe. And then I even have a video series on my channel about this. I took the same approach as I delved more into becoming atheist. In fact, one day, in the quick sidebar, I actually tried being Catholic again for a time, for almost a couple of years. So this didn't just happen overnight from Protestant, being Protestant. So it took a little bit of time. It simmered for a little bit, but I thought, okay, I'm familiar with being Catholic. Maybe that's the answer. But then I was still just so hung up on so many theological issues that I just left everything all together. And I says, you know what? I'm agnostic. I just don't know. And then that turned into being atheist. And then that turned into, now we're talking by mid 2000s. Okay. And me, I'm a pretty voracious reader. So I went out and read everything I possibly could about, arguments against the existence of God, or like about religion, and, all the kind of issues. I wanted other perspectives, and I started trusting more of those other perspectives. So I read The End of Faith by Sam Harris. He's well-known, prominent atheist. Yeah, he wrote his book after 9/11. I think came out in like 2002, 2003. And it was about that, based on the attacks, 9/11. Then read The God Delusion, like many other atheists. It's kind of the Bible of atheists in the mid 2000s.
Sure. Yeah.
And then God Is Not Great by Christopher Hitchens. I started becoming familiar with other atheists. Seth Andrews, he's a really well-known former Protestant Christian. He was even a Protestant. He hosted a radio show for years upon years, and played Christian music, and he was so involved in that life. And now he's again another prominent atheist, outspoken atheist out there.
Did you just go full on atheist books, or did you ever listen to debates between an atheist and a Christian, things like that, or were you kind of just one-sided for a while?
Yeah, it started with the books, and that's a great question, because it segues into then what happened next. Yeah, then when YouTube started to sort of grow out of a little bit of obscurity, one of my serious hobbies on the side is I'm a musician, a composer, and a guitarist. And I started becoming more interested in YouTube because of that. Like, oh, maybe I could use that, create a channel and share music. So then, yeah, it then led into, I found I stumbled across a show called The Atheist Experience It's still on, and it's evolved quite a bit over the years. And that was my first sort of foray into watching debates. Like, it was a call-in show, you know. And these folks who were atheists, you know, they were just, to me, doing just this almost like, you know, mind-numbing, amazing job of just crushing, you know, theistic arguments. That's the way it seemed. It's just they had this great way, and not just in sort of using a Socratic method or, you know, just asking questions too, but just calling out, you know, anything that didn't have a scientific method based approach to getting an answer, or that had real logic and reason to support that. So that's when I started reading so much more on just about logic and reason and understanding what that means, learning about logical fallacies, learning about common, you know, issues against, you know, about God and, well, even Christianity, especially, but religions in general, you know, theism, right? I started getting my definitions more in order with how atheists would talk about their atheism. Like, for example, there isn't just one type of atheist. We can talk more about that later. You know, there's kind of a few different.
Yeah.
But the general definition of atheism for atheists, many atheists, is, you know, a rejection of theistic claims, right? And sometimes it gets slippery with, you know, rejecting any claims about God versus saying specifically there is no God, because atheists consider that anti-theist, not atheist.
Exactly. And I think Hitchens and William Lane Craig got into this in one of their debates. Let's define how the majority of atheists are viewing themselves.
Right.
Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I'm like, yeah, and feel free to cut in anytime. I appreciate this. I like this. Yeah, so then in the atheist experience, you know, which was then became my foundation, okay, I would say part of my foundational knowledge of just becoming a better sort of all-around atheist, okay. I started watching debates with William Lane Craig. I started getting to know other atheists too, and atheist scholars, okay, biblical scholars, and reading the Bible from their lenses, and then investigating from their, you know, perspectives. And sure, and that, you know, forming that definition, atheism, you know, they'll see it. They have, for example, like, you know, people will call in to say, you know, the atheist experience and say, well, I'm not saying there is no God, you know, I'm just saying that I reject, or a Christian.
I'm not satisfied with your answers for the existence of God, right?
So I'm not satisfied with that answer, right? And then so would say, call in and say, okay, then you just don't think there is no God. And then they use this, and this is one of, I'm giving one example, one almost minor example, but this is one of many, you could say, techniques I learned, okay, ways to approach the argument that I could use, say, like a courtroom argument, okay, which a lot of atheists often use, that when you're, when a alleged, okay, say criminal is on trial, right, or is allegedly accused of a crime, that the verdict is either guilty or not guilty. It's not guilty or innocent. So they relate that to belief in God, okay? That rejecting a theistic claim is the same as saying not guilty, okay? But it doesn't mean, like, for example, they use, this is another and a better way to put it. Like, just because I don't believe in X doesn't mean X is false. You see that, right? So, and they'll refer to that a lot. Now, folks like Trent Horn and some other folks, which I've learned quite a bit from them over the years, you know, Catholic apologists, you know, that ends up being a slippery argument for the atheist side, you know, team, you know what I mean? Because there is. And if you get to know, like, Christopher Hitchens was a great example of that. He shamelessly was anti-theist. No, there is no God. Nothing's not it. And actually, a lot of atheists do kind of fall in line with that. But because there's also another sort of approach, okay, or approach that a lot of atheists use. Anytime you give any kind of positive claim about anything, and this is rooted, of course, in a scientific method, and starting with a hypothesis and then testing the hypothesis, is if you say, well, yes, there is a God, then atheists jump all over that and like, okay, you made the positive claim, now the burden of proof is on you.
Exactly.
I'm out.
Yeah. It's a heck of a chess match, that's for sure. Yeah. Everything you say is a presupposition.
Right. And then it becomes back and forth because, and I'll refer to Trent Horn on this again, though, too. Actually, atheists do have their own sort of burden of proof, okay, of demonstrating. Now they'll use as a counter argument, they'll say, okay, well, I can't prove that unicorns don't exist. I can't prove that the flying teapot doesn't exist. Well, you can't prove a negative, okay? And I would use these arguments all the time. And it felt, there's this, and I admit this, so let's talk, you know, and this kind of ties back into my growing as an atheist and becoming more militant, you know. I developed more of an attitude. I developed more of an arrogance about it. I understand that now, and I look back on that. Even if there was some ring of truth to anything I said, or if I had, you know, it was also so filled in this, you know, arrogance of thinking like, wow, everybody else is just so in the Bronze Age, and here I am, you know, more enlightened, and we just need to get the rest of the world to catch up, which, you know, Christopher Hitchens and some of the other folks kind of related to him also had this sort of similar approach. When is the world going to wake up and just, you know, destroy religion altogether? Like, throw it out, you know, the garbage, and then society can become so much,
exactly.
And you know, and so morally just, and you know, and socially cooperative with each other. It's, you know, it's almost like a pie in the sky sort of idea. If, you know, you just cut a religion out of the equation, how much better we would be. And then of course, if science is driving that towards truth, you know, and what,
well, yeah, it's so funny you say morally just, and then you would say, okay, it's pretty subjective. Where do you get such an objective understanding? And then they'd say, look at your side. How you guys say morally just? You have countless divisions that believe different things.
Yeah.
So you talk about a poor witness on the Christian side. Anyway.
Yeah, no, which leads into what I've, in fact, in a video series I have on my channel, I have, it's called Dialoguing with Doubters. And in Dialoguing with Atheists, it's more of a primer guide for fellow Catholics, okay, to start to understand some of the tough questions out there. Because I've been on this crusade or kind of campaign now for in the last few years, especially because the nuns have grown. Like the percentage-wise in the US is about 17% right now, okay? It's grown quite a bit. And the more we have, you know, widely available, you know, access to information like the internet, and whether we have the right facts or the wrong information, everything in between, we have a much more complex problem now of which information is correct and not correct. And people are becoming much more informed, even if they're misguided. You know what I'm saying? So now you're having to kind of sort out more complex questions and arguments. And
yeah, I totally agree. And you know what's contributing to the nuns as well? This is the same that they used to discuss in sales. If you gave someone too many options, they'd walk away. So if they look at the Christian landscape and it's absolutely unfathomable, that has to play a part in it. They claim the truth. This is the apostolic church here. This is that, you know, and part of, I mean, most of the testimonies that I listen to, they have to go through that process where they're, as I describe it, they're going upstream, going back in time, and they start to watch that these fractures are kind of healing, and it just goes to a singular trunk. But so I just think that that's something that should be talked about as well, where it's not someone just rejecting religion just because they can. There are many aspects to this that these people must be fighting and dealing with before they make a decision to just say, away with this. You know what I mean? It's too complicated. There's too much sin, too much hypocrisy, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
Yeah, which then breaks it down to what I say is 3 core approaches that atheists take, and I did too, okay, and engaging with theists when I was a strong, strident atheist.
Yeah.
I break it down into 3, again, types of arguments: the moral argument, the scientific argument, science-based argument, and the biblical scholarship argument. So in talking with atheists, if you watch dialogues and, you know, or atheists on YouTube or even debates or whatnot, it usually revolves around one of those 3 kind of areas. Okay, are we going to go after, like, okay, why does God allow evil and suffering? And, you know, why was there mass killing throughout the Bible? What's all that? So we'll either kind of jump on that, or there's a science-based, anything having to do with, and it ties in philosophy too, with the existence of God, and, you know, and you start talking about different types of arguments, like the cosmological argument, the, you know, unmoved mover, the contingency, you know, and so forth, ontological, theological, I mean, all the logicals, you know, this goes in, you know, those areas from a philosophical standpoint, and then ties into science, you know, because many atheists have embraced scientism of, you know, again, if science doesn't explain it,
Yeah.
that we don't know. And then finally, biblical scholarship, and that includes like now with YouTube and the internet in general, and so much more information available to us. Now you have to deal with, for example, one person makes a video, like one channel, and he goes by Holy Kool-Aid, his channel, and he puts out these really elaborate cartoon-based, sort of rebuttals to Christianity and the Bible. So he has a series on showing how the Old Testament was a bunch of fiction, and including like there were never any slaves in Egypt, and there's been back and forth among scholars about that. And then and again, I'll refer to Trent Horn, he put out a rebuttal video to that. And now you have, for example, one person on one side who shows all these scholarly resources. It's not exactly a very academic oriented video. Like it doesn't have like a lot of citations, for example. A lot of atheist videos don't, or some do, so in fairness, but it's not like you're reading a peer reviewed academic paper, you know what I mean, with that. Okay, and then it's been peer reviewed, but still people have an opinion and a voice, and they're putting that out there, so they'll list the sources. And then somebody, say a Christian, will say, well, no, here, you know what I mean, from both Christian and religious and secular sources, that no, actually there may not have been millions of Hebrews in Egypt, but there certainly were, as a good population of Hebrews. So then you start having these kind of splitting hairs kind of conversations about, is that going to happen? And I ate all this up, Eddie. I did. I loved it because I've always loved to read and learn and study, and this is so fascinating to me. And I kept thinking, I just kept inching closer towards again, just completely annihilating religion. And I say this, and I know they're strong words, but I seriously had that Hitchens approach to it. I wanted it so gone. It was just, impeding so much in life. And I even had this really awful view of fellow, now fellow Christians, but Christians alike, they're just sort of, they're just kind of walking around glossed over, robots, and they just say things like, for example, and we can get into this more in a minute, things not to say to atheists, you know what I mean? And well, and you have the right to do if you do, but, for example, like I have faith and that's what I know, that just drives atheists up a wall, because to quote, Bill Maher, he said it one time, is this, because it's always stuck in my head, it's funny, as the purposeful suspension of critical thinking. That's how atheism, period. It means you're like, nope, forget my critical thinking faculties. I'm just going to be like, okay, I'm just going to feel it and believe it. And then, and away I go, and believe that. And that just doesn't work for, especially the more well-studied atheists, people who are, involved, they're watching the debates, they're reading the books, they're engaging in conversations in forums, or, they're having their own debates.
So you were in that season for 10 years. Is that what you said?
Yeah, over 10 years. Yeah.
Would you say that you were angry? I mean, not just at religion. How were you in general? What was your attitude like? I know you were talking about the arrogance that might come along with that we can all battle by how our internal thoughts and, okay, I've got everything right, that kind of thing. But
yeah, I did. I started out, and in fact, I had met other atheists the same way. They almost go through the same stage of somebody overcoming an addiction. First stage is denial, anger, and there was some of that, including I was angry for the first few years. Sure. I was on kind of a warpath, and I still was actually even years after that, like out on social media and in any opportunity in a more public forum that I could sort of stick it to people of like, sure, well, kind of a joke, haha. Yeah. I was kind of rotten in that way. And then I learned from other atheists, though, over time that, okay, am I being really productive? Am I just sort of being, I'm just being immature and I'm not being rational about how I'm presenting my arguments or positions. I'm just being mad. Yeah. I learned to kind of grow out of that and not necessarily be just mad at God. I was over about being mad at God, but I was still mad at people. Like I wanted people to get over it already. Like, let's stop this.
What was your view on, let's say that you could foresee your death in 5 years, 20 years. Did you ever go there? Did you think about that? Did that have any relevance, or did you, like, I've heard other people say, yeah, you just end and that's life.
Yeah, and I did. I became like, and because of a combination of reasons, I eventually became almost severely nihilistic, really, and not every atheist falls into that trap, but
Sure.
there's this progression, or I would say even digression. Things devolve over time. It's more, especially the more you're just in that world and in that space, and I can't say everybody's affected that way, but I was, and that I kept getting inside my head about that, and then eventually to the point that, yeah, I pretty close to what's called methodological naturalist, and just in being a naturalist is that, okay, nature explains
Everything.
evolution and here's where we are. And that's that. And that though became, again, it devolved more into nihilism. But I had a surgery, one and only surgery in 2010, and I had to be put under anesthesia. And I remember, and I was in some pretty severe pain before that surgery, and I did have surgery, and afterwards I woke up, and it was funny because that was my first experience in reconciling death. That I thought, okay, now anesthesia, I was still to some degree breathing, but if you understand the process, it's really, the doctor's doing the breathing for you essentially. And, there's a bit of all of it, but at least that if that's what nothing is like, you know what I'm saying? And I don't know, then, okay, I get, that's it. Right.
Yeah.
That's it. So I somewhat resolved in that way. And I was in the military at that time too, for a few years. And there again, I that's a whole other perspective and stuff with that. But I'll say something about this. Here's something that's ironic. During my whole time as an atheist, whenever I did get in the subject of religion or even in Christianity, and if I had to give any positive about anything involving that, it was always about Catholicism. Seriously, like even I would say, like to folks, like if they were like shopping around, wanted to be Christians, I was like, well, if you're really going to believe, if you're really going to do this, when you're committed to it, I would joke sort of like go to the OC, the original. Okay.
You're like faith and reason.
Yeah. Yeah, right. I'd say that. And I said, and thinking something I still like, and even now, part of why, created my channel and, reaching out to Catholics and people seeking, out the Catholic faith. And for example, how it pertains to the Eucharist and an issue we have within the church right now, about 30%, only 30% of Catholics are more or less, believing in the Eucharist. But I and it's still to this day, but I would even explain that, to friends kind of seeking out a faith. I would say, the Catholic Mass, for example, I said, from my experience, I said, it's the one experience, okay, of Christianity in that world where every time you go to Mass, there is a supernatural event taking place. Like it can't get any more spiritual than believing that, the body and the blood of Christ are right there being consecrated and you're taking that in and what all is happening with that, it's a miracle like every Mass. And that's, to discount it, or sort of make fun. Seriously, it's so that's why when I'm at, Mass, it's something very special to us. The whole cadence of it has its meaning. So I would explain this to even like my army buddies and so forth, too. Wow, really? Because, so I'll tell you another quick sidebar story. Yeah. When I was in basic training, for example, every Sunday they would allow us, and you and I talked a little about this in our last dialogue, they'd allow us on Sundays to go to any church of choice. And so I would go to Catholic Mass sometimes, but I would do that, one, because again, it gave me 2 or 3 hours out of the week where I just wasn't, being yelled at all the time and just going through misery, in training. And then they often had buffets after church. So, that was one time a week where we actually ate, more than like 100 calories in a day. No, it was a lot. We're burning. Yeah. So yeah, it was kind of a little vacation. So I did that, but I would have, like it was interesting. Some of my Protestant army buddies, they were like this the first time they went to like Catholic Mass. They were just like, what is this with Christ being crucified and all the horror of it? They just, so anyways, going back into how this all ties into, again, my years as an atheist. Yeah, it was 10 years, well over 10 years, very outspoken about it. I also engaged in my own debates regarding atheism. I then gave talks. I even, where I lived before here, I live in Arizona right now. I lived in New Mexico for some time. And I actually gave talks at a few like community centers and at a spiritual center, interestingly enough there. I talked about, atheism and the need to, and for that audience, they were more spiritual, but not religious. So I was even kind of fitting that in. We just need to get rid of religion altogether. And you can maybe be at the minimum spiritual, whatever that means, but let's move towards a world that's just secular, oriented. I became a secular humanist. So I belonged to an organization that was focused on that. And we would even have services on Sunday, interestingly enough, that was almost like going to a church service, but without the God part.
Yeah. So it was more of just a community. Is that why people loved it? They just, that human desire for people to get together, maybe? I mean.
Yeah. In fact, I met, interestingly, a lot of atheists, agnostics, so forth, years who, what happens is it becomes, I heard it referred to this, and I don't mean this in a kind of, in a derogatory way too, but it was, it's been referred to as sort of the new homosexuality and coming out about being atheist. For a long time, if you were an atheist, it's such just a bad word.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
You could even say, I don't believe, but if you say the word atheist,
yeah,
worse, so I had to deal, quite a bit, with that. And anyhow, that's how I became even more active. And then I noticed in talking with other atheists and going to secular humanist center I attended, and fellowshipping and going to great dialogues, like really interesting conversations about social topics. And I just, I nerded out on that. It was really great. But so many former religious people, let's call it that for now, who missed, they missed being in a church kind of environment or being able to fellowship in that way, but they just didn't want the God part or the Jesus part or anything part. They just, so, and story after story of people, like, especially like atheists, for example, who live in places that are more just all around, say, Christian communities or other religious communities.
Yeah.
Feel like they're an outcast. They feel really isolated. So I also did some outreach, so to speak, for some of those, folks that, try to find ways to help them feel more included and meet other atheists, and build like more atheist communities. So.
Got it. Let me ask you this. As an atheist, what were your thoughts on the antithesis of Catholicism, which is Satanism? Did that become, if you reject religion, did that include Satanism, or did you view that as, oh, this is just a mockery of something? How do atheists view that? That's kind of, I haven't researched that. I'm just curious, because if one thing is you're so against it, and you see that there's another side that is so against this, that they are praising the opposite of this, desecrating hosts over here. Do you just say they're both just ridiculous? Or do you see atheists that gravitate towards pure evil? What do you see?
I didn't have much experience like meeting atheists who wanted to gravitate to Satanism or actually embrace it. Because in general, and sometimes it's hard to generalize, but in this case, most atheists are just neutral. Either way, they just don't accept any supernatural type of claim. So if there's no God, then there's definitely no devil either, or anything related to that. So why embrace any kind of even remotely religious sort of philosophical system or organized in that way, that may resemble religion or religious system. And there's also organized religion component, which a lot of atheists, and even spiritual but not religious, they run from. Okay. So it was a lot of that. Now, atheists would, funny enough, defend Satanist rights to, for example, like when it comes to freedom of religion and worship, in our country, they'll push for like, okay, if everybody has freedom, religious freedom, then that includes Satanists, and they'll support that, right? They'll also, for example, show how Satan, that we could all be, okay, now this can sound like a little sort of mind, kind of numbing or mind bending. That's the word I'm looking for, like mind bending and watching a movie sort of like this. But some atheists will even approach it like, what if we've had it all wrong? Like what if this has all been flip-flopped, that actually Satan is the good guy and God is the bad guy? Okay, and they'll relate this because of the Bible, because for example, right? And then when you really understand the context of this, it blows up the atheist argument. But they see the argument. In fact, some atheists have actually counted, approximated how many people died because of God, so to speak, in the Old Testament. Okay, so we're talking like in the millions and the millions. And then many atheists love to use this argument, how God supposedly was responsible for the deaths of millions of people, but then Satan is responsible for only 10.
Oh.
Okay, and that's in Job, story of Job, and that's because God actually gave it, hey, go ahead, you know what I'm saying? So this is something, what I'm saying is and then trying to engage with an atheist and have the conversation. They often have a lot of these mic drop questions or responses, like, bam, you know what I mean? God's the killer, not Satan. Now what? You know? You know?
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, very much. So then they say, and then I had learned a story. So many years ago, I'd also, taken classes in philosophy and comparative religion, so forth. And I had actually learned a story in past like mythologies, like the story of the fall of, Lucifer. Okay.
Yeah.
There's actually a version of the story out there that the reason why Lucifer was kicked out of heaven was that God created humans and then said, okay, to the angels, I need you to serve them now and be there for them. And Satan, or Lucifer, stood up and said, no, I'm not going to do that. And God's like, what do you mean? And he's like, because there's nothing greater than you. I'll only worship you. So the moral of the story, kind of the twisted moral of the story is that Lucifer loved God so much that he wouldn't serve humanity. Okay.
Got it.
I actually told the story to some Jehovah's Witnesses one time just to get them out away from my like, that's how kind of rotten I was.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? I'm giving context, Yeah. So I told them that, and of course they were like this, and like, we'll pray for you, and as if I were a Satanist too. But anyways, these are just examples of like how far deep you can go into understanding what you don't believe and then supporting it, why you don't, and then throwing all these curveball questions to theists, in particular Christians. Like, okay, how are you going to get out of that one now? Kind of arguments, right? But Satanism, to go back to the original point, no question. No, just because for, again, a lot of atheists, they just
consistency.
Yeah. Like it's deity or something out there. Nope.
yeah, for sure. So then how did you, I don't know if you're at that part of the story, but what happened? A series of things happened to get you back into Catholicism, or was it back into the Protestant camp a little bit first?
Yeah, no, it was actually just Catholicism. What happened is in those last few years, from about 2011 into 2014, I became more interested in, not only was I now atheist and really anti-theist, very much so, also started becoming mythicist. Now, this is a really small camp of people out there, but they're still an important camp because they have pretty big voices out in the atheist world. And that idea being that Jesus maybe never existed. And there are some probability related arguments that point to that, and there's scholarship out there to show sort of like, either he did or he didn't. Okay.
Sure.
I was a little more agnostic on that position. I actually became agnostic on that position. That's what I mean. Then as I was reading all the sort of relevant literature on it and studying those scholars, there are people like Dr. Robert Price, Dr. Richard Carrier, Hector Avalos. There's some folks out there. Some of these people are professors too, or have PhDs in theology or related ancient history. And they've supported this now that, yeah, maybe Jesus just never really existed. And it was just some kind of, it was created out of what's called Jewish angelology. Okay. Like old sort of Hebrew sort of ideas, beliefs, and understandings. And that eventually kind of led into, this creation of like the Jesus story, which even that just has a lot of problems. And you can go to like a good secular scholar is Bart Ehrman. He helps flesh a lot, kind of, solve some of that, kind of problem, despite his own sort of views about Jesus. But I spent a lot of time on that scholarship. That's what I mean.
Got it.
And it led to a point where I saw a debate between Trent Horn and Richard Carrier, again, who's a well-known atheist and also now a mythicist, okay, about the resurrection of Jesus. Like, again, was it possible to, okay? And this is what opened the door first, okay? Because Trent was super prepared, right? You know, and I had watched other debates between Dr. Carrier and some other folks, and he would just, even if like Dr. William Lane Craig and some other folks, you know, where it just seemed like he would kind of demolish their arguments. But some of that was bias, you know what I'm saying?
Sure.
I was rooting for him, like,
Yeah. Well, everyone jokes about that in the comment sections. It's like, how many of you are actually changed? You come in with your own confirmation bias. He won. No, he won. How many are neutral when they go to listen to these things?
That's right.
Yeah.
They still end up lining up. You know what I mean? They kind of walk away with, you know, like, I won, my side won. You know. So that debate, you know, that was sort of organized that way. They did have, you know, atheists and theists there in the audience, and I watched Trent. I was just so mind blown by Trent, actually, you know, too. And I give credit. Sound like I'm kind of gushing about it, but he is a part of why I reverted with that.
He's an exceptional apologist, absolutely exceptional.
Yeah, and it kind of like, and so I have to say, I had two reactions to it. One, I was like, wow, this guy is supporting all his arguments, like, not just solid, but just like, wow, these are really hard to refute, just his positions. And even if some of it is you know, even going into the area of speculation, you just get such, okay, or and how we consider evidence, and there's so much to it that my reaction was like, wow, somebody just sort of knocked me on my kind of rear about this, you know, my intellectual rear, okay. And my arrogance down a bit too with that, because I was like, okay, yeah, I don't know it all, atheist, you know, guy. And then I started to feel pretty ashamed, I have to say, Eddie, really, about myself, because I have a background, or now an even more cemented, solidified background in science, okay, and that's in physiological psychology, okay. It's kind of it's rooted in neuroscience, so a lot has to do with that, and that's over the last several years, you know, in getting that education. But even before that, you know, I've, and as a professional writer too, I've done some science writing and some other. So I consider myself somebody who is, you know, sort of loyal to the scientific method and accepting, you know, not just turning away information, you know, like actually taking it all in and investigating it. But no, I had developed my own tunnel vision, and that debate showed that. I was like, wow, there are so many angles to how I could have looked at scholarship and different, you know, angles to the resurrection argument, that I was just kind of like, nope. And I've seen it, like there was a recent debate between Trent and Matt Dillahunty. Matt is from the Atheist Experience, and he's really rose to, you know, prominence and fame over the years. And they had a debate recently about that. Is it reasonable, the resurrection reasonable? And it comes down to this, which is another important sort of strategy to understand, okay? And that can sound like it's a conversation ender, like it just kills a conversation, right? Is how do you know? How do you know? How do you know? How do you know? You know, it's a lot of that. And it was even in that debate, you know, it always was like cornering theists into that. Well, how do you know? You know, and that's still the kind of approach it is, you know, often taken. And I would even use some of that. But then when I started seeing through not only Trent, but then there was also Tim Staples and Carl Broussard and Carl Keating from going back when. Folks throughout the years who knew how to like really shoot major like holes in these, you know, sort of more atheist, you know, related arguments, you know, or sort of worldview. And sometimes I even use that kind of carefully, because some atheists will jump all over me about that. Like, you know, there isn't just one atheist worldview. Okay, but there's a general sort of agreement that, you know, they don't reject, or they reject theistic claims, you know. So anyhow, that was the starter. That was the catalyst that started the road. And then from there, it was a lot of like, you know, as cliche as it may sound, but it was soul searching from it. I was also going through some sort of family related stuff that didn't really affect or influence much me making the decision. But I was looking at my whole life, re-examining my whole life, some other choices, you know, not so good choices I've made in my life, you know.
Did you ever feel that you had left and stayed, you know, left religion and stayed out of it for so long because you were running from anything? Because in my years, I would say that was the case. That is not to generalize everyone's position, but I know that there are also people like me that they realized, crap, I was running from something. So religion, specifically Catholicism, what Christ asks of us is a lot. And Jordan Peterson's been talking about this. That's what's so amazing about his chat with the gentleman that's in the Eastern Orthodox gentleman, Pagot or something like that. Anyway, that gravity of realizing what it would mean to pick up your cross. Yeah. Was that ever part of it? I mean, I don't think you would have been conscious of that in the moment, maybe, but looking back.
Yeah, absolutely. And so to refer to Jordan Peterson, you know, because I've read some of his works, and it's funny, I read his first book, which was called Maps of Meaning, when I was first exploring psychology and getting into the field and the education. So then when he became famous in the last few years, I was like, oh, that's the guy who wrote Maps of Meaning. And then he wrote the 12 Rules for Life. And I have a lot of respect for the guy, but something he said, and I even use this as part of my own and teaching about the Catholic faith, actually, and, you know, so this is going to tie into your question, right? And how it affected me is this shift in the last 50 years, right? 50 to 60 years, particularly in Western society, from responsibility, personal responsibility and accountability. You know, we see that from our parents and grandparents' generations and so forth. Even if, you know, to the bitter end of hating each other, there was just this loyalty and responsibility into family, and, you know, had some of its good and bad, but it had some important,
a lot of good. Yeah, absolutely.
And we move towards rights and privileges, what I deserve, what I need, what I should have, how I should live my life, whatever makes me happy. I should be able to make my own choices. And because it could all end tomorrow, I should just live like almost like a libertine, you know, just, you know, or even like a libertarian too, in that sense. Like everybody should just do what they want to do. So I developed, I had adopted quite a bit of that. And then I had to sort through that, because I would say in the 10 years, those 10 years that I was not only, again, atheist, and again, there may be atheists out there who agree with me and they say that they're, you know, they're pretty morally strong on 2 feet and whatever. But I can say, though, it allowed me to do a lot of things I probably shouldn't have ever done, and think about things I probably shouldn't have ever done, and consider, you know, it just opened so many doors of moral
subjectivity.
Yeah, very much so. You know, and it was like, because if I can justify why it's okay in this circumstance to do this, fill in the blank, you know what I mean? As long as we're okay. And as long as you have, for example, you know, 2 people want to rob a bank together, as long as they consent, they agree, you know, they'll, you know, and that's probably a bad example. That's more in actually committing crimes, right? But it's still, I went down a real dark path. I did with it, you know. I wouldn't call myself like necessarily evil per se, or at least I don't think. But I also, looking back, I didn't want to accept maybe much of the evil thoughts I did have, you know, dark, really sort of disturbing, really how I viewed people, and
sure,
you know, like dealing with even like bad things happening in the world, you know, just really just dismissing humanity, you know what I mean? Like there's just a lot of garbage people out there, you know, and we just really need to sort of thin the herd, you know what I'm saying? And
well, yeah, I mean, this speaks to what is a properly formed conscience anyway. What is the baseline? What? Yep. Because who the person next to you could say that's perfectly legitimate. Go for it. Descend into chaos, and everything will work out. Who are you to say? You know, I just think that's fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. That's very helpful. One other thing about, and you weren't even finished, so go ahead. And
I was going to say, so what else led after this? Yeah. And I want to explore on this, because it's going to sound outwardly kind of abstract, but what really helped me then make an even bigger jump to reforming my faith and becoming Catholic, you know, again, reverting, Catholic, was, and you may get some, you know, debate about this out there for sure, about consciousness. This being still kind of nebulous idea. Like we can relate it, and we see it throughout the animal world and mammalian world though too. Sure, there's this awareness, you know, that creatures have, okay, and perception around us, and what that means and how we evaluate our surroundings, internalize that. Sure, you know, that can tie into our, you know, consciousness and how our brain functions. But there are some key serious mysteries about it, about like, what, for example, why, you know, and some people could refer to evolution, okay? You know, that will, of course, evolution is a big part of that, and how our brain develops and how we produce consciousness and so forth. But one of a few different things. And there are folks like Sam Harris out there who are trying to prove how science can explain it, and they haven't really been able to do that yet, is why we care about anything metaphysical. Why at all, ever? You know, why are we philosophical beings? Why? And now some atheists could jump all over this, you know what I mean, and say, well, because then maybe they'll assume that I'm going to say, I'm going to do a God of the gaps argument of like,
oh, of course, yeah.
But no, there's a lot more to flesh out. This is what's great about St. Thomas Aquinas.
Yeah.
You know, the others related to him in Thomism, you know, it just helps flesh a lot of that out. But as it pertains to consciousness, and I've wrote a bit about this and written a bit about this, I mean, and I was stuck on that. I was like, you know, it didn't make me leap just to like, okay, now I'm going to be Catholic, but it was a big factor in understanding my own, you know, morality. Okay. And seeing that, wow, it seems like we're actually to some degree hardwired to understand this, like neurologically we are. Okay. And this is just one person's position on it, right? Just me and Chris, you know, I think, yeah. But that there are just enough mystery. Okay. There is plenty of mystery to that, to how it functions and how it relates to our soul, you know, our soul, and how we're going about and growing and interacting with the world around us, and how we view morality and so forth. There are just a lot of like unanswered questions, whys and how do we produce it exactly? Why do we produce it to the degree we will? Some people would say, well, other animals, like I said, mammals have consciousness, like whales, they have bigger brains than ours and they're really smart. And yeah, but well, I'm sorry, whales aren't, you know, writing books on, you know, like,
how do you know?
Not to oversimplify the argument either. You understand?
How do you know they're not doing that underwater? You don't know them.
I'd love to ask that, right? Exactly. You know, they could be communicating in their language, you know, trying to figure out questions. Okay. You know, yeah, because I never like, for example, like, you know, because I have a pretty good understanding of evolution, and I never liked, like, for example, when theists would ask questions like, well, you know, if we're descendants of apes, why are there still apes? And like, oh, you know, and you have to explain this is all part of one big family tree, and ancestors and life isn't.
That's been my go-to for way too long. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so you have to kind of really flesh it out. So it relates to kind of, you know, and again, I wouldn't call this, I want to qualify this right now, that it's not necessarily, I'm not saying that it is the best argument, but it's a very powerful sort of thing to consider and think about, okay? Yeah. That it ties into our walk in faith, okay, and our relationship to religion and spirituality, and how we're trying to understand all that. So what I mean by that is there is something to it. And then if there is something to it, then you start stepping up the ladder from that, right? If there's something to that, then maybe there's something to the belief systems. And then if there's something to say like
belief systems, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Something to that, then maybe there is a truth to that. And then if there's a truth to that, then maybe there's a truth to Jesus. And if there's a truth about Jesus, then maybe there is a God. And, you know, and kind of step like that.
Another thing is that when you mentioned people saying the Old Testament, throw it out, it's fiction because of certain aspects. Well, archaeological finds are very fascinating in that regard. And I could imagine that being part of someone's journey that you were just describing. If there's some there, there's some there. But, you know, what was it? Tel Dan inscription, Hezekiah, Bulla, the Sennacherib's prism, all these things that have been discovered that, you know, if you're super skeptical, you just say, oh, piecemeal, or it's the equivalent of a proof text from someone that's debating you on a position in the Bible. But comprehensively, you can't deny these findings. You wanted evidence of something in 900 BC, there it is, and it perfectly corresponds to the time period described in this book of the Bible. So I think that that's something that, again, fits into the puzzle that you're describing as the light bulbs start to go.
Absolutely. And also that, you know, and one atheist position is in regard to that is, you know, and it's often a slam to, you know, the Bible and people who read the Bible of, you know, the Bible was just written by a bunch of goat herders. You know, that was it. They were just, you know, they didn't even know which way, you know, was north or what too, but they, you know, they managed to kind of write this Bible thing, which just, it's just a terrible thing. You know what I'm saying? But it does lead into some of these kind of other problems of assuming that everybody was just dumb.
Yep.
Till the 19th century. And then, or in the 17th, I'll even say this, 18th and 19th centuries, an age of enlightenment and And then all of a sudden everybody is like, okay, we figured it out, you know, and everybody else was just off the rails, you know, for hundreds of thousands of years and had no, you know, intellectual kind of approach to this or anything like that, which is, yeah. And so that's kind of the position, you know what I mean, taking. So then you give the references that you did, and it shows that, you know, that we actually have a lot of good historical testimony and evidence, you know what I mean, that does fit, right? At the end of the day, is Copus.
Yeah.
Willing to have a conversation about it. So yeah, so that was all. And in fact, you know, in my time, in my atheist years, you know, and I mentioned that I started moving towards, you know, becoming mythicist. And even right around that time, if you remember the Zeitgeist movies from the mid 2000s.
I mentioned that in one of these testimony videos, that's what rocked me for several years.
Right. So I had watched that, and this is after I was already atheist, but I was just, I'm trying to give sort of another sort of point here with this, right? Because there's so many I could make in the subject, but my position, how I took this, how you become almost like intellectually sort of sadistic and, you know, of like wanting people to be wrong or like really stick it to like, like when I watch Zeitgeist, you know, and the first part of that, okay, of being about religion and, you know, it basically at the end of the day, just being complete nonsense. Okay.
Sure. Yeah.
And again, there was like, you know, it seemed like it was really well researched. And then there I was some years later of just like, oh, a lot of the arguments in there are actually really bad, but yet I embraced them. Like, you know, for one, because it seemed like they were well researched, which is bad science. You don't just seem anything or assume. You actually you know, you don't. And two, that I just had so much buy-in.
Yeah.
I did. I was like, okay, great. Another person coming out and, you know, sort of knocking out, you know, the theistic world. It's just, you know, this is what I'm trying to get across, even as strong as I'm presenting it, you know, that this does exist. There are some, you know, there are all types of people out there, right? And there's some, you know, yeah, decent, you know, friendly, you know, I'd say good, you know, atheists overall, they're the two. But then, you know, there are a lot of folks on the other extreme, and there are folks who want to know, like they want answers. They want to know if they can believe or not, you know.
Of course, yeah.
Arming themselves with all these arguments that, like, you think as a theist, you're just never going to get out of them. And, you know, having studied a lot of Catholic apologists now over the years, you realize that, oh, wow, actually, we do have a lot of good arguments to refute. You know what I'm saying? You know, that the standard, and also I'll finish with this, and I'll open up to questions again here too, if you have it, is realizing that every argument I had, just about every argument, was not an original argument. Was it?
Yeah.
Nothing is original. I mean, you may get the occasional somebody, you know, claim that, but when you go all the way back to Augustine, you know, and forget Augustine, if you read, you know, St. Augustine, that's one example of Catholics go to with that, but you could just have even many after that, and even up to today, of, you know, folks who have pretty much just ripped apart religion in every which way possible and asked those questions. And then it seems like now under the new atheism guise, like this is now sort of profound. I'll give a kind of funny example. You remember many years ago when that workout system, P90X, you know, the home workout system, right? Okay, I thought it was kind of cool, but I kind of got a little like about it when I remember I first watched the infomercial about it, okay? Because the way they spun it, and it was some good marketing, you know, of like, you know, the way to build muscle, right, to really grow and weightlift. And I've been into weightlifting for years, but it was like they, you know, science have unlocked, okay, muscle confusion, the advanced muscle confusion. Okay, now for anybody out there, if you don't work out, it's like, okay, what is Chris talking about too? But this is something that weightlifters have known for like 100 years, okay? We always known that you want to confuse your body and you have to keep finding ways to grow and challenge your muscles and stuff too. But the way it was positioned, you know, in this video, like it was just this new breakthrough, you know what I mean? Now everybody's going to know how to work out and build muscles, you know? And it's the same thing with atheist arguments. The way they're being presented is like, wow, these are so profound. And it's not just to sound like, you know, a jerk about it. I mean, really, it's, and it makes people though stop and go, geez, I never thought of it that way, you know?
Sure. Yeah.
Like and I'll say this real quick, sorry, I mean to ramble on about it, but I had an interesting conversation with my father when he was alive many years ago. And I asked him this, and I was so proud of myself in that argument, like, you know, sort of like winning the argument. I hate to say it like that, but I questioned his beliefs at that time. And he said, and he'd given this argument that I heard many theists give, like, well, I have faith, you know? And then I asked like this, because many atheists will ask this, right? I said, okay, is there anything that can't be justified by faith? Any belief that can't be justified by faith? Let me think about that. Well, no. Okay, well then is faith a pathway to truth then? Is it a reliable pathway to truth? And then I remember my own father being kind of like, oh, wow, Chris, that's a good one. I'll have to think about it. And I was kind of like,
yeah,
you know what?
Got my own dad there. Yep.
Exactly. So,
you know what we'll do, because I'm going to have to cut it here.
Oh, yeah, no problem.
We should continue this on your channel, do some more of the Q&A type stuff and you know, kind of flesh out some of these things, but very fascinating, man. I appreciate that. What a journey. It's great to have you, obviously, in the church. It's great to be doing some work here on YouTube. Yeah. And if there's anything else you want to add about what you're up to, I mean, I'm going to leave your YouTube channel link in the description, but if there's anything else you want to add before we go, feel free.
Yeah, just that I did. And again, per our last dialogue, I do have a video out there that does explore some of my militant atheism on the channel. You know, I'm talking about that a bit. Again, the channel is primarily a resource for fellow Catholic Christians or those seeking out, you know, the Catholic faith. And you know, part of my mission has been to also help in catechizing, you know, Catholics and just, you know, getting stronger in the catechism and so forth. So I'm very much glad to be, you know, here again and back home. I appreciate this time today, Eddie. And I also appreciate some of my wanderings and ramblings, because there's so much to, cover, you know, 10 years of being in that life, right?
It's good. It's good, man. And honestly, when you talk about kind of being scatterbrained, is that describes so much of my journey too. I'm like, what am I doing? Is that not part of the human condition as well? Like, you're looking, you're seeking, you're trying to understand. There's a lot, you know, so it's pretty humbling. Anyway, everyone, hopefully you enjoyed the video. Share it, like it. Please subscribe to Chris's channel. And until next time, take care and God bless. Bye.